with us in the fire and the flood. We can sing that relatively easily, can't we, here? But brothers and sisters around the world will be able to testify to the truth of that in a very deep way, with us in the fire and the flood. You've not forgotten us. Please do have a seat, everybody. I'm going to ask Ash Bence if you come and read God's word to us. We're going to hear a scripture reading, and if you haven't got a Bible and you would like one, please do raise a hand. Somebody will pop one in it. Matthew chapter 5, we're going to be turning to. There's a hand at the back. Ash, thank you ever so much. Thank you. And after we've heard God's word read, then Caroline Cox, Baroness Caroline, will come and speak to us. Thank you.
The reading is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 12, which is on page 976 of the Church Bibles. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
I said that our speaker would come and speak next, but I can't really let her do that without saying a word or two to introduce her. And first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to Martin Haslam, for making our introduction this evening and arranging this special evening that we're enjoying together. So Martin, thank you ever so much, you and Jennifer as well. Baroness Caroline Cox became a peer, a life peer, in 1982 for her contribution to education. She served as Deputy Speaker to the House of Lords for 20 years and now sits as a crossbencher, speaking in debates on many of the troubled parts of this world, many of which she has visited. Her humanitarian work has taken her to see many of them. In recognition of her work in international humanitarian and human rights areas over the past 20 years, she's received many awards. She is a founder, president of the Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, HEART. And we are very thankful to you, Caroline Cox, for coming to speak to us tonight. Would you? Please.
Well, thank you so much for the enormous privilege of being here. You're a lovely church, aren't you? I'm lovely hearing church bells, being beautifully rung. I was a church bell ringer for 70 years. I started at the age of 15, so you can work what that means, but where I am and why I hobble up the steps. But also the music band, wonderful, thank you. So it's a privilege to be here. I'd like to begin, if I may, by introducing myself, a little more modestly in your embarrassing introduction, because all I ever say about myself is I'm actually a nurse and a social scientist by intention, that's what I thought I was doing in my life, and a baroness by astonishment. I wasn't into politics. I was the first baroness I ever met. You wake up one morning and find a baroness looking at yourself out of the bathroom mirror, and it's quite a shock. But of course, it's a huge privilege, because it means you're going to speak in Parliament and the House of Lords. So I asked God how I use this privilege. And the message came very clearly. To speak in Parliament is a wonderful place to be a voice for people whose voices are not heard. And so that's how I try and use my role in Parliament, to be a voice for people whose voices are not heard. And it's one of the reasons why I set up HEART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, and we're going to travel in a moment and meet some of our wonderful partners. But I just have one other strand, and maybe of some interest to you, to my life, and that is I also do a lot of work for Muslim women in this country who suffer from Sharia law marriages which are not registered, and they're vulnerable just to divorce. The man says, I divorce you 3 times, and they're left with no rights. ways that suffragettes would turn in their graves. So if you look me up, you may see that I have a private member's bill. I've had 10 years trying to help those Muslim women who are suffering in ways that should not happen in our country. But tonight we're going to visit our wonderful partners on the front lines of faith and freedom. And Heart was established, as I say, to be a voice for people whose voices are not heard. And we work with local partners. And we tend to choose places where other people don't go, either for security reasons, because they're usually active war zones, and it's our partners who are living there, and they are real heroes and heroines. But the other reason why people may not go is for political reasons, because if a regime is repressing a group in its own realm, area, they don't give permission to the big boys like the UN to go, so the UN doesn't go. So we spend quite a lot of our time crossing borders illegally and completely shamelessly, because it's a huge privilege to be with our partners there, trying to provide both aid and advocacy. I've got a piece of paper in front of me. Am I meant to know what this paper is?
Just service order for tonight.
Oh, thank you. I'm stopping halfway through, aren't I, for a break? Yes. Thanks for reminding me. A bit small print, actually. But anyway, no, seriously. So I want to invite you to travel with me, if you will, and meet some of our wonderful partners on those front lines of faith and freedom. And we always come back humbled and inspired by their courage, their dignity, their faith, their generosity. They are heroes and heroines. So the title, as you will see, can you see through me? Most people can. But anyhow, as long as you can see, I want to get out of frame, and I want you to actually see the screen. Can you see the screen round there? Because we're going to meet people, and they're the people I want you to remember, to take away in your hearts and prayers the pain and the passion, the privilege of making a difference. And I see if I can make a difference. Aha. So Heart, as I've said, provides aid and advocacy for people suffering oppression and persecution, largely neglected by the major international aid organizations. We're going to begin in Armenia. Now, Armenia was the first nation in the world to become Christian as long ago as 301. Now, that happened. It happened actually in this building that you can see in front of you. This is a very old, it was in those days, the king's house. And Gregory wanted to bring Christianity to Armenia, but the king didn't want it. And so he condemned Gregory to 13 years, where he was just thrown down at the bottom of a dungeon. The dungeon is that circular thing at the end. I've been down there many, many times. It's about 30 foot deep. And Gregory was meant to die down there. But the king's sister took a shine to Gregory, and every night there's a little slit halfway up, and she put food and water down that little slit, and Gregory survived for 13 long years in that horrific dungeon. Then, none too soon, really, the king became fatally ill, and he said, who can heal me? And they said, the guy at the bottom of the dungeon, Your Majesty. So Gregory was hauled up. He still had his principles about him, because before he attended to the king, he looked after the girls whom the king had been abusing. Then he turned his attention to the king, healed the king, and the king became a Christian and declared Armenia as the first Christian nation in 301. And it all happened there, and that I've been down that dungeon many times, and we always pray for those suffering persecution when we're down the bottom of that dungeon. At the back you can see Mount Ararat, and that's a little poignant, because Mount Ararat is Armenia's national symbol, but when Turkey committed the genocide in the last century and took all of Western Armenia, Ararat was part of that, and it's now behind Turkish borders. So they see their national symbol behind Turkish borders. Okay, seats on, seatbelts on, no jet lag. We're off. Armenia suffered, I've already referred to it, the first major genocide of the last century, when 1.5 million Armenians were murdered by Turkey. And Nagorno-Karabakh is an Armenian enclave. Stalin had this policy of taking bits of land and putting them in alien context, called oblasts. And he took this bit of ancient Armenia and located it in Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan did not really treat the Armenians very well. And there was an attempt by Azerbaijan to carry out ethnic cleansing in a bitter war from 1990 to 1994. I was there many times. That's the little land, in case you haven't quite got it in your mind in terms of geography. That's that little land there. It's about the size of Wales. In that war, I used to count 400 Grad missiles a day pounding down on the little capital city, Stepanakert. You might say, well, how do you count 400? I'm afraid it's dead easy. Anyone here who speaks Russian will know that Grad is the Russian for hail. So you get 40 lots of Grad, you get 400 of those missiles a day, and one will do that to a building. So that little city was pulverized, and many of the other towns and villages in that little land. And heartbreaking. On one of the occasions I was there, I was told that Azerbaijan had now started using low-flying aerial bombers, aerial bombardment, and they dropped these huge 300-kilogram bombs from very low height. And I went to this place where one of the bombs had fallen, and these two guys were coming from the front line, because I'm afraid under that pile of rubble are the wife and the two little girls of the guy in the blue jeans. Nothing they could do about it. But it was the most high-intensity conflict in the world at that time, in the early 90s. But new life, hope and healing for the hopeless, and beauty from the ashes of destruction. When the Armenians managed to hang in there, and a ceasefire was signed in 1994, and in heart, we always believe in asking the local people to identify their priorities for aid. We don't tell them what we're going to do, we give them the dignity of choice. They know their needs. And they said, please, you want help for people with disabilities. The Soviet Union had no care for people with disabilities at all. I know that. I did a lot of work with the orphans in the Soviet days. So they gave us a bombed-out old building. I went in buildings that weren't bombed out. And our wonderful hero of the peace, Vardan Tadevosyan, the guy with the bright red trousers there, he really is a hero of the peace. And he's turned that bombed-out old building into an internationally recognized center of excellence. It is inspirational. And as I say, it's recognized as a center of excellence, but across the whole of the South Caucasus. And recently, the director of the International Committee of the Red Cross, they don't do disability, but she's in Karabakh, she had a special interest in disability. She visited it, and it blew her away. She said it was 40 years ahead of any rehabilitation center she'd seen in any of the many countries where she'd worked. We have wonderful, wonderful partners. They really are heroes and heroines. But in the autumn of 2020, Azerbaijan unleashed a new war on Karabakh, supported by Turkey, with massive military resources, including illegal use of cluster bombs and targeting civilians with drones. It was hell on earth. I was there during that war as well. And war crimes. You're not meant to bomb places like hospitals. This is the maternity hospital in Stepanakert. They hit it with a direct hit that was left to the maternity hospital. And they hit the power station, so people hiding in basements and cellars. It didn't have any electricity, they had no light, no heat. It was hell on earth. And Vardan Tadevosyan, who is a hero of the peace, he's the guy in the blue anorak to my right. The other guy is actually a good colleague of mine. He was a chaplain in the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines for 20 years, called David. But there have been harrowing cases where Azeri, that's an adjective for Azerbaijani, where Azeri soldiers have captured Armenians, taken their phones, then taken videos of them torturing and executing the prisoner, and sending those photos back to the family. And one of those ladies who I met in Armenia recently, who lost her husband, said she did not dare to look at her phone. Can you imagine doing that? Seeing your son, a member of your family, being tortured, and then they did beheadings, a horrible, slow way of sawing the heads off. And Azerbaijan, I'm sorry to say, continues to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity with impunity, including continuation of detention of Armenian prisoners in violation of the ceasefire agreement, which was signed at the end of the 2020 war. And they agreed to release all prisoners. Armenia released the Azerbaijan prisoners. Azerbaijan is still holding on to a large number of Armenian prisoners and sends back rather horrible pictures of their treatment. And that's in violation of the ceasefire agreement and also destruction of sacred sites. So that's Armenia. We'll come back for questions and answers. If you have any questions, I'd be only too pleased to answer them. But for the moment, we're going to keep moving because we've got a lot of places to visit and time is of the essence. Seatbelts on, no jet lag. We're off to Burma. We call it Burma, not Myanmar, because the local people prefer that, and we respect that. Here we are, crossing over from Thailand into Burma. Incredibly beautiful. You can't help being exhilarated by beauty, but you have a heavy heart. because you know you're going into a land of anguish. The Burmese military in previous years, and now it's doing it again, would attack the villages with the military offences with shells or aerial bombardment, and usually in the jungle, the homes are made of wood, so everything just goes up in smoke. And hundreds of thousands have been driven from their homes. And this phrase came to me 2 or 3 years ago when I was there. Where do they go? They've got to run. The bombs are coming in. Where do they go? It's just a long road to nowhere, to become internally displaced people or flee into exile in overcrowded refugee camps. And that's some of the people on that long road to nowhere, just anguish. And we sometimes ask kids if they will draw, and it's most powerful, because what they draw is the reality as they know it. And this little lad says it all. That's his world, just destroyed trees. And he's writing in English, which is interesting, he says, I'm very sad. But a light in the darkness again. Dr. Sasser, wonderful guy from the Chin Hill tribes. I met him just very, very briefly. The Chin Hill tribes are very, very remote, desperately poor, really rough terrain, and there was no healthcare at all because you couldn't get health workers there. It's high mountains, thick jungle, fast-flowing rivers, and people would die of things which you could treat or prevent, like malaria or septicemia, and they were desperate for healthcare, but they couldn't get it. You were not allowed education beyond secondary school because the regime didn't want to have educated people. So Sasser was sent as a kid, age 16, down to Rangoon to study in a high school there. He had to learn Burmese, he only spoke his native language, and he lived in abject poverty between a cow and a stinking toilet. But he came out as head of the school. He then did his pre-clinicals in India, and he heard there was a country called Armenia where you could study medicine cheaper than in Britain or America. So I met Sasser in Armenia studying his medicine. Again, in abject poverty, he was having to work while he was doing it, had to learn Armenian, which is a 5th language and a 5th script. Amazing guy. And as I said, his vision was to train community health workers to provide that life-saving health care for villages deep inside Trin State where there was no health care at all. After graduating in June, quite a few years ago now, he immediately returned to his people. They cleared the dense jungle, they built a training centre, and sent messengers to over 150 villages, just walking through the jungle. There are no roads there, just have to walk, inviting each village to elect a guy and a girl to come and train as community health workers. By November, it's pretty quick going, June to November, remote area stuff, but everything was ready. 317 students had come from 153 villages to begin their training to become CHWs, and some had walked 5-7 days through the jungle over the mountains to attend. We were there for the opening, that ceremony, and they'd have to have textbooks sent up from Rangoon, and textbooks are pretty heavy. Imagine the number of textbooks you need for that number of students, and carry them over the mountains, cross the rivers, through the jungle, and there is Dr. Sasser with his wonderful smile. He's a real hero. We revisited for their graduation a year later, and our medical advisor told us that the CHWs had the knowledge to save the lives of 8 out of 10 people who would previously have died. People would die of old age or cancer in remote areas, but the kind of things they were dying from were things like diarrhea, which is a quick killer if you don't know what to do with it, septicemia, malaria, things that can be treated and prevented. And amazing achievement. Not so long ago, over 1,000 had been trained and working in a lot of villages. 500 villages benefit from their activities, and they continue to save the lives of 8 out of 10 people who would previously have died, with a catchment area of 250,000. Isn't that fantastic? We have wonderful partners. There's Dr. Sasser, and there's a map of Chin State, and every little dot, if you can see the dots, is a village where there's community health workers are saving the lives of 8 out of 10 people who would previously have died. With Health and Hope, that was what the programme was called, which we were privileged to support, well established, Sasser responded to pressures to enter politics. He phoned me up and said, Mama Caroline, he always calls me Mama Caroline, it's sweet. Anyway, Mama Caroline. Sometimes he calls me Sweet and Honey Mama, which is really, I tell my sons, they don't call me that. But anyway, he phoned me up and he said, should I go into politics or should I stay with this? And I said, Sasser, it's not up to me to advise you. But I do have a principle in life, that if God opens the door in front of you, and it's not something which I had envisaged or organised, but God opens it, you ought to be willing to go through it. And if it's what he wants you to do, he'll give you the resources you need. And Sasa did go into politics, and almost immediately, I mean, 10 years, very, very popular throughout the country, it's well known. He was going to have a very senior position. But the Burmese military regime suddenly, about 18 months ago now, unleashed offensives against, they had the first really democratic elections 18 months ago, democratic elected government. But almost immediately, the regime unleashed another military offensive, killing and imprisoning elected MPs, including names some of you may know, Aung San Suu Kyi. Others fled into hiding. Sasa just escaped and was chosen by the elected government to be the international representative. He's been designated a traitor by the military regime. Please pray to him, because he's in constant risk of assassination, and the price on his head is up in millions. The regime really want to get rid of him. But he's an inspirationally competent spokesperson for justice and truth. You sometimes see him on the BBC, and he is an inspiration. Okay, seatbelts on again, please. We're off to South Sudan. South Sudan suffered a war inflicted by the Islamists. There's a difference between Islam, which is Muslim faith, and Islamism, which is the ideology of organizations like ISIS and Daesh and the brutal terrorist organizations. So the Islamist regime in Khartoum ruled from 1989 to 2005. They unleashed a war against South Sudan in which 2 million perished, 4 million were displaced, tens of thousands of women and children abducted into slavery. Systematic slavery is used as a weapon of war and persecution. It's estimated there are still many enslaved in the north. But it was our privilege to be there in those days and to help rescue many hundreds of slaves. But it was hell on earth. This is one of those visits. And we were staying in one village, and the Islamist Arab soldiers from the north attacked the nearby village. And in the morning, the casualties started coming in. And this guy, they shot in the face at point-blank range. See, all his jaw has been shot away. There was nothing we could do for him there in the bush. We didn't have the money, but we did manage to charter a plane to take him and other casualties down to Kenya for treatment. He died 4 days later, I'm sorry to say, but less pain than he would in the bush. The others did recover. But it was horrendous, and there were so many slaves. And that's one of many encounters with slave raids, and I wrote a book called This Moral Trade, in which I give many of the first-hand stories of the reality of modern-day contemporary slavery in Sudan, also in Burma, there's a lot of sex slavery, Uganda, the Lord's Resistance Army, and of course we have some on our own doorsteps. Going back to South Sudan, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed in January 2005, brought some peace for South Sudan, a referendum for independence, and the celebration of the birth of the new nation, independent nation of South Sudan on July the 9th in 2011, had the privilege to be there. But that jihad war had left South Sudan devastated and destitute. And civil war resulting from that has created new tragedies and massive displacement. So today is a place of the glory and the grey. The celebration of independence, yes, but wars continue. Humanitarian crises abound. This, for example, is up in Bahr Ghazal, in the northern part of South Sudan. That's someone's home with a family. In the rainy season, that will last 2 minutes. But they still smile. I love, well, almost everywhere where people have incredibly courageous smiles. Look at that little lady's lovely, cheeky little smile. That's her hand. You may not have seen leprosy, but that is leprosy. I found it a privilege to hold that lady's hand. And as I was holding that lady's hand with leprosy, and there's no treatment out there for it, this phrase came to me. St. Francis of Assisi: pity weeps and turns away. Compassion weeps and puts out a hand to help. What a privilege that we can do that. What a privilege. And that's the end of the first half. I think there's a break now, and then there'll be a second half, and time for questions, answers, criticisms, comments, whatever you want. Thank you very much. Am I down the stairs? As I fall down on my nose. Big stairs.
Oh, Caroline, thank you so much. It's hard to take in what we've seen on the screens and what you shared with us. But we are going to sing once more, and I suggest as we sing, maybe we turn the words of this next song into a prayer. So can I invite the band please to come and join me at the front? Invite you please to stand as we sing, and then we'll hear the second part of our address this evening.
You're still here. Very gracious of you. Can I just say, if anyone is at all interested in heart, there are some of our newsletters or leaflets do help us out if you want us to read a little bit about our wonderful partners and the wonderful things that they do. They really do bring light into some of the darkest parts of the world. We're now travelling to Sudan itself, which was the old North Sudan, and the president of the International Criminal Court, indicted the former president of Sudan. He'd been adopting genocidal policies of ethnic and religious cleansing of Africans and non-Islamist Muslims in Blue Nile, southern Kordofan, and Darfur. We travel, these are places we go to. You don't hear about them. On the whole, the UN doesn't go to these places. This is a place in Blue Nile, and as you see, it's been completely devastated by aerial bombardment from Khartoum. With Khartoum's constant aerial bombardment of civilians in new mountains in Blue Nile, 500,000 been displaced and hiding in caves deep with deadly snakes. It's better now, this was 2 or 3 years ago, and 250,000 had fled as refugees into South Sudan. In January 2017, we visited civilians forced to flee from their homes in the Nuba Mountains and live in the caves with the deadly snakes. Whenever we arrive, the local people always say, "What's your priority?" And they give us the choice, and we felt we had to meet these people hiding in those caves of the deadly snakes, because they weren't being reported. I slightly regretted it. Early the next morning, we found ourselves at the bottom of a very high mountain. Had to scramble up that mountain, but it was important to be there, because here are the people, and I could show so many pictures, but just hiding in those caves with the deadly snakes. And these people said that when the aerial bombardment from Khartoum comes, 50 people will crowd into that cave. I met one girl who'd survived a cobra bite, but many don't. It was hell on earth. In January next year, 2018, we visited Blue Nile State, and Blue Nile is predominantly Muslim people, lovely, lovely people, but they're not Islamists, so they're attacked by Khartoum. We met 9,000 Muslim internally displaced people forced to flee fighting, and they were at the risk of dying from starvation. They were suffering pangs of hunger and reduced to eating leaves and plants with no nutritional value, but just to try and ease the pangs of hunger. And here they are. They crowded around when we came in their hundreds and hundreds, and they were desperate. Alleviating the pain of hunger and potential starvation, we managed to raise, we're very small in heart, there's only 5 of us in heart, we managed to raise £50,000. It may not sound very much, but £25 will feed a family of 7 for 3 months until the rainy season comes. So we were able to save many, many lives. What a privilege. Seatbelts on again. Nigeria. Islamist terrorist attacks continue in northern and central states, with almost daily reports of killings, rape, abductions, mass forced displacement, and land grabs. The human rights organization Inter-Society, which I respect, reports that 4,400 Christians were killed within a 9-month period last year, and that's in addition to the tens of thousands of Christians killed since June 2009. And just to go back for a moment to figures, we don't hear about it in the press, we don't read about it in the newspapers, but in the first 6 months of this year, 3,000 Christians were killed just in Middle Belt alone. I know I've been there. I've been in Nigeria twice this year, and we've seen the burnt villages. We've talked to the people who have suffered the horrendous massacres and the cruelty that goes with it. In one village which we visited, and their homes were still charred with burning and so on, and those who survived just told us one story. I won't repeat any more because that's pretty gruesome. But when the Islamists, the Fulani militia, were attacking that village, they found an elderly lady, like me, and they said, "Oh, Grandma, you look cold, we'll warm you up." And they threw her into a burning home. I mean, the cruelty, the tragedy is indescribable. And thousands of students have been abducted from school. You've probably heard about Leah Sharibu, she's one, but there are thousands of them, and hundreds of churches have been destroyed, and entire communities overrun by jihadists. And many Muslims have also been killed. This is the University Church in the town of Jos, the capital of Plateau State, and I could show you so many pictures like that. And then hearing the stories of people who survived the attacks on their villages. And again, our reports have so many examples of what they tell us happened to them. This lady, we heard gunshots. 13 people were killed and their bodies were set alight. They burned homes. An old man who couldn't run was killed. I've been to Trundongikura. Another report, and this is from the church in Dros, the capital of Plateau State. They came around 7 in the evening and left just before midnight. More than 200 of them in black cloth, well armed. Yesterday we lost another 19 of our people. And that's St. Timothy's Church in Dros itself. And in the Middle Belt region, which is between Plateau State and the capital, thousands, said check how many thousands, I haven't done it, it is many thousands of Christians have been massacred and up to 3 million displaced. These include children desperate for education. They can't return to their burnt schools and it's too dangerous. So at heart, we take education to them. And this is what we do to try and get education to those kids who are displaced. They're desperate for education. There's no future if they can't have education. So we have our Roads to Hope vans, which take them the things they need, including the mechanisms you can have to keep your computers alive and so on. And the smiles on their faces when we go, it's so poignant. And one of our heroes, one of our partners there is the Anglican Archbishop of Dros in Plateau State, Archbishop Benkwashi, his lovely wife Gloria. And one of his messages to us, 2 messages, said, if we have a faith worth living for, it is a faith worth dying for. Don't you, that's us, compromise the faith that we, that's them, are living and dying for. They are. The statistics, I'm speaking at a Roman Catholic conference on Wednesday this week for Persecuted Church Wednesday, and the figures are up in the thousands. And a challenge, if you don't resist now, your grandchildren are going to have to fight the battles that you did not have the courage to fight. And at the moment, we are totally ignoring what's happening in Nigeria. You don't hear about it on the news, you don't hear about it on the BBC and the British government. I challenge them again and again and again. And there is no help going to the people in the Middle Belt at all. And there is a lot of just, well, allowing things to happen. I call it complicity. And our final destination for this evening, because I want to leave time for questions, is Syria. We visited several times from 2016 to 2018. The first time we went driving up from Damascus to Aleppo up in the north, we just go mile after mile after mile of devastation. This is a town called Malula that had been occupied by the jihadists for 3 months. They destroyed everything. They would have taken away the Virgin Mary. Since they were got rid of, they replaced the Virgin Mary. They're trying to rebuild. But that's one of the places where I never forget. I haven't got a photograph of it. I stood in a room where 3 men had been killed for refusing to convert to Islam. They were shot in that very room. One was as young as 22. You really see persecution. And all the holy places are desecrated as one picture that speaks for hundreds. Good interfaith relations. This is a meeting, and you see there the imams and the mullahs, and the Christian group, and the Yazidis. Those very, very good interfaith relations. And this is an Armenian church there, which we worshipped in on a Sunday morning. The bombs are falling all the time, because it's only 350 meters from the front line. The kids were singing beautifully. And I'm afraid some of them may probably been killed by the bombardment since then. But it was a very special time. And in that very church, the front row was full of the imams and the mullahs, our Muslim friends, and the Yazidis, and of course the local congregation. It's a wonderful interfaith relations there. What we're trying to do, trying to aid and advocacy, we again ask local people, what's your priority? And there's a town called Malula, and that's the one we saw the picture of, which had been occupied and where people had been martyred and so on. In Malula, we asked them, how can we help? What's your priority? And they said, the women there, they're mostly widows, they needed help as they collect food and preserve fruit and vegetables to alleviate the food shortages, which are dire, and to make some money to enable them to rebuild their homes. And there are two of these lovely ladies, some of the fruit that they've managed to collect and preserve, and my colleague David with us. But when we were in Aleppo, while the shelling from the jihadists was still intense, we met a Chaldean Catholic priest, and I'm going to finish with his words because they're so powerful, who put into words in a Christian analogy the essence of what we in heart strive to do. It was that after the service, and as the bombs were still falling, the war was going on, but he came up to us and he said, "Thank you for coming." You will all know the story of Thomas the Apostle. When Jesus appeared to the others, Thomas wouldn't believe unless Jesus appeared to him, and he said, "I won't believe unless Jesus comes and puts his hands into my hands and side." And Jesus did. And so like Thomas the Apostle, who when Jesus came and said, "Put your hands into my wounded hands and side, now you believe, go and tell." And this is what the Chaldean Catholic priest said. He said, like Thomas the Apostle, who put his hand into Christ's wounded hands and wounded side. This is a powerful phrase. You came to put your hand into the wounds of our suffering. We can't know the suffering they've gone through, but we can, very powerful image, put our hands into the wounds of their suffering. And he said, now you have seen our pain, you can believe, go and tell our story, which is what we tried to do, and we're such a privilege to tell some of their stories tonight. And what can we do? We can pray, but prayer without deeds is dead. We can try to help on the aid side with the rehabilitation with all our wonderful partners. We can be advocates for peace, justice and freedom, speaking truth to power, raising these things with MPs. We don't hear about Armenia, we don't hear about Nigeria, do we? Well, why not? And we can promote greater awareness by many churches of current persecution and encourage their active support for those who are suffering, for holding their front lines of faith and freedom, and above all, to pray. One of the things that humbles me most is when we're with our brothers and sisters in those terrible situations, you say, what's your priority? They always say prayer. I'd be asking for food. But they do ask for prayer, and that we can truly honour. And that's our motto in heart. We're so small, we could feel pretty paralytic with the enormity of the needs of the people whom we try to serve. But our motto is, I cannot do everything, but I mustn't do nothing. And if we all do something, we can know a little bit of the privilege of making a difference for some of our brothers and sisters suffering persecution, whose voices are not heard in our world today. So thank you for letting me share the pain and the passion. Thank you. Have you got time for a few questions? Of course, yes, I left time for questions.
Oh, thank you.
Or comments or criticisms.
Yes, let's use the handheld. Thanks, Chris. We're going to pray in just a moment. Emily's going to lead us in our prayers. Before we do, we have a few minutes for some questions. Would anybody like to ask Roland? I'll pass that so everyone can hear.
I just wanted to ask, when you raise matters in Parliament, what sort of response, do you get a sensible response?
I get a lot of support from other... Is this on? I get a lot of support from other peers or backbenchers in the House of Commons, a lot of support from the government, speaking truth to power. And why do we never hear about Nigeria? Why do we never hear about Armenia? Why do we not hear the latest things that are going on in Burma? So there is a lot of silence on behalf of the government, but a lot of support from other members of Parliament in both houses. But that's the challenge. Mm-hmm.
Brett, I'll come to you just a minute. On my way back,
What sort of support would you like from the government? What practical support could they give?
Thank you. Well, two kinds. I think would fit with our own remit of aid and advocacy. We'd like them to call the governments to account that are carrying out these atrocities. You know, Nigeria, 3,000 Christians killed in Middle Belt alone in the first 6 months of this year, and many more since then. I hardly dare open my emails in the morning because there'll be more reports of killings in Nigeria or by Azerbaijan, of Armenians, coming in all the time. And yet, the governments get away with impunity. And so we would like them to call the governments to account, and if needs be, to raise these issues in a more practical way, maybe with sanctions, but to do something to stop the governments carrying out their horrendous massacres, perpetration of violations of human rights, and so on. And on the aid side, lots of money goes to countries and isn't really accounted for. I mean, I have a huge support and sympathy for people of Pakistan, and they suffered, of course, they suffered the floods, as you will have seen. They get megabucks, but there's not much reporting on what happens to those megabucks. Whereas £25 will save a family's 7 lives for 3 months and enable them to survive. I'd like to see a more focused and relevant and accountable form of aid in some of the parts of the world that most desperately need it, like Nigeria. Yes, please. Yes, I'm happy if you can be in touch. I'll give you a card, and we can give you some hard information. There is, with Aid to the Church in Need, which is this big Roman Catholic organisation that I'm working with this week, we have actually got a petition out as well, which we just want to raise awareness and get the government to respond more appropriately.
Welcome to our church, Baroness Cox. And I'm Brett Stoner, and I'm from this church. And on the news at the moment, we have got people, there's been trouble in the Ukraine. What do you think of that?
Well, it's very real trouble, and deeply concerned, and I am glad that we do hear about it. I'm glad the British government is helping practically in every way, but I wished it wasn't only Ukraine. You know, I in no way belittle the suffering of the people of Ukraine, but I wish our government would do a similar response to people suffering like the people of Ukraine. You've just seen the photographs that I've shown of what people are suffering in the countries where we're working. So I'd just like to see that extended. But it's a real issue, a real suffering and needs help. Sorry? Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Here's one at the front, Martin.
Caroline, can you hear me all right?
You speak into it.
All right, can you hear me now?
I can you?
Caroline, you've mentioned in the past a few times that we rather hold back from criticising the Azerbaijani government because they provide so much oil for us. Is that true? Is it really worth it?
Could you hear the question? It's an issue which I'm glad you raised because it does explain, in a rather uncomfortable way, the reality of what's happening. In that earlier war in Nagorno-Karabakh, which I showed, when the 400 grad a day were pounding in on Stepanakert, and I had photos I took myself of children shredded by cluster bombs. Now that's a war crime. To put cluster bombs on civilians is a war crime. So I went to a senior person in the British government. I can't say his name because it was an off-the-record meeting. But I showed the photos and I said, look, Azerbaijan is using cluster bombs on children. It's a war crime. Will the British government make representations to the government of Azerbaijan to stop dropping cluster bombs on civilians? The answer? No country has an interest in other countries, only interests. We have oil interest in Azerbaijan. Good morning. And that said it all. And I was so mortified and furious, I quoted that on the floor of the House. I didn't mention his name because it was unofficial, but I quoted it and I said, I'm ashamed to be British. I said, I'm not naive. I can understand commercial interest. I can understand strategic interest. But I don't think it's in the long-term interest of any nation let those obliterate concern for human rights. And I don't think the majority of British people would want oil at the price of cluster bombs on children, at least without saying something about it. But I think that's behind, if we look at the dynamics, if we look at the politics, if we look at the economics, so many of the countries where we're not saying anything have mega interest. Azerbaijan is one. BP's investment in Azerbaijan is mega. But we also have a lot of interest in Nigeria and so on, and we don't want to upset the political equation. And that's the heartbreak. But it's why it's so important to be there, A, to provide the help which they're not getting, and B, to be a voice for them.
Thank you. Time for one more question, Peter.
Baroness, welcome. As a child, I grew up in the war-torn zones of Sierra Leone.
Sorry, I missed that.
I grew up in Freetown, Sierra Leone.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Then I moved to Aden in the Yemen. So my question to you, because these conflicts are still going on generations later, how do you end conflict?
Well, if we knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be here tonight. We'd have ended it. It's very hard. All you can do, all we can do, is be alongside the people, be their voice, try to get justice for them, try to get aid for them, and try to show the unacceptability of the reasons for the conflict. But it goes on, as you rightly said. As you know, I mentioned earlier on when I spoke about Armenia, you know, that first war was in 1990. All those years ago, it's gone on and is escalating. So this is a big challenge. But I think a certain amount of political pressure, if you be in touch with your MPs and try to get them to raise these issues with government, to stop the carrying out of the crimes against humanity, the war crimes with impunity. I wrote a report on Azerbaijan's impunity, just to try to get our government to bring justice. That's what is really needed. But we've still got all the work to do, so we need to pray and ask God how he can help us to bring about, I'm sure, the peace and freedom and justice that he would want. Does it answer your question? It's not really an answer, but if I had an answer, I wouldn't be here.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us for coming down from Witney in Oxfordshire this afternoon to be with us here in Lindfield. We are so grateful to you, not only for what you've shared this evening, but for your leadership and your courage, speaking out on behalf of, well, millions. And we're so grateful to you. We're going to pray in just a moment.
Thank you for letting me share the pain and the suffering.